Good morning. I'm Jim Busbin, and I would like to thank Jack for giving me an opportunity to speak to you this morning on the subject of stewardship and, in particular, my practice of holy habits. It would be difficult for me to address the holy habits I attempt to practice without first talking about how I came to them. Years ago, when I was heavily involved in several of Ascension's annual stewardship programs, I quickly learned that stewardship actually has nothing to do with the parish budget or fundraising. To my mind, it's not about that at all. As I learned and now believe, stewardship is the period of time in which we specifically give thanks to God for the gift of creation and to acknowledge the responsibility we have as stewards in being given dominion over God's creation. I look at it as a kind of unofficial liturgical season in our calendar that usually occurs in the fall. It's a time in which we reflect on the responsibility of being good stewards, and also a time to discern, to listen, and to pray how God is leading us to use what God has given us, our time, talent, and treasure, in the mission of God's church here on earth. It's a time for us to put into practice the words of the offertory presentation statement we often use here. All things come from thee, O Lord, and of thy own have we given thee. Perhaps it is, so how does this work for me? Perhaps it is just a behavioral trait as one grows older, but I've come to pay more attention to my spiritual health and journey lately, and to focus on self-imposed obstacles I place between myself and the everlasting presence of God's love. For me, that focus leads to practices in my personal life that I believe will chip away at those self-imposed obstacles, and which draws me deeper into my relationship with God. I believe this chipping away process brings me closer to a "Here I am, Lord, use me as you will" relationship with God. It leads me to a deeper discernment of how I return to God my time, talent, and treasure, and makes God the priority in my life that I know God should be. The practices I use in this process tend to work for me and form my holy habits. I don't pretend to be proficient in what I do, or even that I do them as often as I should, but within my brokenness, I try. There are two practices I would like to briefly describe to you this morning that I enjoy. The first practice is what I'll call holy listening, and the second is the practice of theological reflection. The practice for the holy listening, the practice I describe and utilize as holy listening, is the combination of finding thin spaces and utilization of centering prayer. In describing this, I would say we all have places where we go and very much attuned to the presence of God. For me, the thin space I most often use is right here in this nave, empty of people, sometimes dark, sometimes only lit by the flame of a sanctuary lamp, and most importantly, very quiet. I sit in silence and attempt to block out all thought and vacate my mind, something I can do well these days, of all externalities. I then listen in complete silence. I spend a 20 to 30 minute session with a prayer by asking God to lead me to do God's will. The second practice, theological reflection, is one we perform as a group in our EFM class, whereby we attempt to become more efficient in looking for God's presence in our daily lives. We identify or focus on something from our daily lives using a four-source model, that of Christian tradition, society or culture, personal experience, and personal belief. We begin to explore that focus with theologically based questions and performing contrast with the other source categories, We discuss the answers we come to and conclude with what we have learned through our discussion. We then discern what we can apply in our daily lives, which is the important thing, the takeaway. These briefly described practices are what I consider to be my holy habits. They are what worked for me at this time in my spiritual journey, in drawing me closer to God and making God a priority in my life. And for this, I give thanks.